You're listening to Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast. Criticaleye is a global membership community with over 2 decades of experience supporting senior executives in their roles. We work with board-level executives, giving them opportunities to build their knowledge, skills, and access independent reference points outside of their immediate networks. Whether you're stepping up into a more senior role or aspiring to do so, looking to hone high-level stakeholder relationships, drive operational performance, build your own personal resilience as a leader, or have longer-term career goals such as moving into a plural career, Criticaleye's approach supports a range of leadership challenges and ambitions.
Welcome to Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast, where we explore what it means to be a highly effective leader in today's business climate. I'm Bridgette Hall, Senior Editor at Criticaleye, and in each episode, we invite senior executives and thought leaders to share their perspectives on the challenges shaping leadership today. Today's discussion is titled Leadership in the Age of AI and Automation. As organizations embrace digital transformation, leaders are facing profound questions. How do you empower teams when technology is reshaping roles? How do you retain talent when employees are concerned about automation? And how can leaders drive cultural change at the same pace as technological change? To explore this, I'm delighted to be joined by Rob Hornby, co-CEO at AlixPartners, and Rita Clifton, Deputy Chair at the John Lewis Partnership, and a Criticaleye board mentor. Together, they'll share their insights on how leaders can embrace technological innovation and human leadership in an era defined by AI and automation. Let's dive in. So I guess we'll just kind of set the scene with both of you. And this episode is about how technology is changing organizations and impacting the way executives and boards lead. It's a big question, but I'd like to get your take on it. How are leaders having to adapt? Maybe, Rob, I'll come to you first.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about all of this. It's a subject of considerable interest for me. I'd begin by saying I don't think technology is changing organizations as fast as the hype would suggest. There's a lot of pressure on leaders to adopt AI, the latest hype wave. But the truth is, on the ground, things are moving more slowly. It's proving more difficult. The technology is less mature than advertised. And this is unsurprising, or should be unsurprising, because exactly the same thing happens in each hype wave. But the AI hype wave is a particularly big one, and therefore expectations of change to organizations has been discussed extensively. We will see profound change, but it's likely that we're 2 years away from the sorts of things that people are speculating about at the moment.
Yeah. Rita, what about for you? What are the kinds of questions that are being asked at your board?
Well, I think, to be honest, we're all having to ask ourselves or look at ourselves and pose some fundamental questions. And those questions are, who are we? Why are we here? What can we bring to our customers, our employees, people, the world, etc. I know these sound like rather large questions, but I do think that we all need to remind ourselves when our brains are exploding with the number of presentations and possibilities that, AI, agentic AI, that's certainly a word of 2025. I mean, I don't think agentic actually came out of my mouth until a few months ago. So I think that there are some basic questions, but also I think there's some basic sort of, management guidelines here, which is you have to keep your head amongst all of these questions, the hype. I mean, Rob has put in a sense of perspective here about how quickly things are changing. And it was interesting, I was speaking to a quite seasoned executive recently. And they said to me, do you know, with all this AI stuff, in inverted commas, I'm so glad I'm retiring. I mean, it's just, it is blowing my mind and, I can't wait to get out. And I don't know about other people, but I feel actually the opposite. I feel the opposite because I think that the opportunities that that AI is bringing, the opportunities to automate so many of the things that many of us actually found either exhausting or boring or whatever, we can actually bring a sense of humanity, and the importance of having humanity in leadership now has never been greater. So I see a lot of opportunities, I see a lot of possibilities. I certainly see a lot of concern, which we as human beings have got to make sure we understand in our people. But in terms of thinking, what are we doing? Why are we here? What does our brand stand for? How can we bring what we do to our customers and our societies even better? I think these are exciting questions, and I think we can focus more on actually these fundamental questions, hopefully, as we are gradually being released from some of the more mundane tasks that can drag you down.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on that in a little moment, but I want to go back to something Rob said, because you mentioned that we're about like 2 years out of the, the real hype of what's being said around AI. And I think you're alluding to like general artificial intelligence there and it really being on another level. But at the moment, what do you see as some of like the biggest challenges for companies where it's not actually like moving as fast as maybe the hype is saying?
Yeah, so it's principally a maturity question, but it's also a what is it question. And I'll make some comments that intersect with Rita's. So firstly, AI is not new. I attended my first series of AI lectures in 1990, and the machine learning algorithms that came out of all those decades, because it began in the middle 1950s, are very mature, they're very powerful, and they're underused. So what we say to many of our clients is start with some of the things that are actually proven and decades old. The thing that's not mature is generative AI. And it's bringing what I would call bottom-up productivity gains in content creation, in coding, and in conversational tasks. I call them the 3 C's. What it's not doing is it's not orchestrating itself to take on a job role like a human. At the moment, it can sustain that kind of activity for about an hour before its error rate exceeds 50%. And if you imagine how your boss might feel if your error rate exceeded 50%, it's not really a very viable threshold. So at the moment, the technology can't orchestrate itself consistently like a person does for long enough to do a job like a human job. And it's going to take quite a long time to get there. At the moment, that what's currently an hour is doubling every 7 months. And so in a couple of years, we should be able to see much more complex task execution. And at that point, we might start to think about replacing certain types of job role with artificial intelligence. But there's a huge caveat, and it goes back to the things that Rita was talking about. AI has no emotions, it has no conscience, it has no sense of meaning, it has no moral capacity, it has no genuine empathy, it is not embodied. It's very, very different to a human. And the AGI debate for me is entirely on the wrong footing, because what we're really talking about with AGI is whether AI can mimic our cognitive function. But humans, I would argue, are a great deal more than that, including at work. And so I personally think we're miles away, decades away from any debate as to whether AI can actually replace a human in the holistic sense. And we keep giving the impression that AGI is very close. It's I think, a deliberately imprecise term, but we're not going to extinguish the unique human features for a very long time. And we have the opportunity of redesigning work around those features so that humans can be more human. I think this is what Rita was saying. And AI can be good at the cognitive tasks that we're actually not very good at. We're not very good at sustaining repetitive computation for long periods of time. And therefore, there should be a symbiotic relationship between the two. But all the talk is about replacement, and I don't really know why.
Yes. And just building on Rob's point there about, in some ways AI is going to enable us to be more human and behave in a more human way. And actually, why is that relevant? It's relevant because, long-term value in organizations, or indeed long-term influence, depends on relationships, long-term relationships, with your customers, with colleagues, so that they're building an understanding and ways of working together that's truly productive and ideally, makes people a bit happier. Maybe we can come back to some of those very human needs and desires, etc. But I remember, many years ago, there was a textbook, an MBA textbook, and it was marketing warfare, and had a tank on the front, and it had a tank on several pages. And actually, it talked about ambushing the consumer and guerrilla marketing, actually, as in GUER, guerrilla marketing. And I was thinking, if we are trying to build long-term relationships, because that's after all what gives you reliable value and reliable earnings, we should really start using the language of relationships and actually the nature of relationships to do that. And so therefore I'm cheered by the possibility of AI taking away some of those tasks that actually make us sometimes feel a bit less human, actually. And we are going to we need to train humanity into AI. I mean, it's very interesting. I'm sure many of the people who might be listening to this call, if you go on ChatGPT or whatever, sometimes it can feel like talking to a human being. I mean, it's giving you feedback, it's giving you positive affirmations. That's a great idea, Rita. I mean, if you're not careful, you can get a bit carried away, but someone consciously created that kind of characterization in a that makes you feel as though you're dealing with somebody. So it needed a human to train that kind of tone, humanity, etc. But in the end, that's a facsimile and a scaling of humanity that a human being had to conceive and generate in the first place. Now, I think that's very interesting. I think it's interesting, for example, distinctive customer service, because you do need, humanity, empathy, understanding, even being good at NLP, which I don't think, AI is particularly good at yet, to understand great customer service, how to listen, how to understand. Now, what could be exciting about AI, and particularly we have a distinctive service culture in an organization, is you can then scale that up and make sure that you've got a longer tail of support and service that fits with your brand style, your customer service ethos. So again, I can see the possibilities. We can all see the challenges, clearly we can, but I can see the possibilities, and I think some of those possibilities are very cheering, and they're very cheering for our organizations, and may well meet the fundamental reasons why we are here a bit better.
Can I just add to that the there's a myth, I think it's a myth anyway, about business, that business somehow isn't about the whole person. We say things like, oh, it's not personal, it's just business. I've always thought that's extraordinary nonsense, because when I was promoted into the co-CEO role, of course, you get some kind people who come on LinkedIn or whatever and say things about you. No one said to me, it's great to see you in this role because of your superior cognitive function. they all said things about me as a person. They said relational things and the things that they perceived were good about my character. And of course, business is just another human domain of activity, and the whole self is in there. So this weird idea that somehow we shut down various aspects of our human selves in order to function in business, to me has always been mystifying. And frankly, to the extent that I've had any success, it's been by doing the exact opposite and building very long-term trusted relationships with people that simply can't be replicated by AI because it doesn't have the faculties to engage in that kind of way. So it'd be great if we were able to embrace, and I think it's really healthy that we're talking about what humans are. It's a long time since we've really done that, and AI is giving us an opportunity to think about who we are as humans, what's distinctive about us. I don't believe we're just biological machines. And it's a great debate in business because I think if we're really honest, a lot of business is conducted on a relational basis and not on a cognitive function basis.
Mm. It's such a great point. And I think, if you don't mind, Rob, I'll just tell a quick story about when you and I had a conversation before the summer. I mean, actually, the great thing is Criticaleye have been wanting to bring Rob and I together to have a conversation. I think it started actually having a conversation about purpose and the value of purpose and how it's showing up in organizations and purposeful leadership. And maybe we might come on to that because it has become super relevant both in this conversation and also many others I'm having. But Rob and I, and I think in the nicest possible way, we're thinking how nice that Criticaleye are trying to bring us together, but not quite sure exactly why. So we have the conversation in the diary, swap notes, and I mentioned to Bob. Look, I mentioned to Rob that I felt that AI fascinating, but even more fascinating in some ways was that it would mean that leadership would need to be more human and have many more or softer skills would be even more important because we've got AI to, fill some of the harder edge and harder, more implementation elements that we need to be great leaders. Anyway, we were having the conversation, and suddenly Rob was saying, "Yes, well, I've written a piece about human understanding and human flourishing and Aristotle, and I happen to be a classicist, and it was the first time actually I've had a conversation with a business person, another business person, about Aristotle and eudaimonia, which is human flourishing." And then before you know it, Rob and I were then on to what we believed about leadership and humanity and whole person, etc. So it was such an interesting example of you can stimulate these kinds of very human conversations, get to very human priorities faster when you use the stimulus of what AI is going to do. It was just a really great example. I think I'm remembering right, aren't I? Rob, about our conversation?
No, you absolutely are. And to be honest, I was a little bit apprehensive about the conversation. I was thinking, it's in the diary. I'm absolutely sure that Rita's not looking for 30 minutes with me. I'm not sure what to say to her. I'm sure we'll be polite. Maybe we can keep it going for 20 minutes. And of course, it turns out there's lots of surprising features of our background that are similar that you perhaps wouldn't guess. And again, it's a great illustration of the fact that so much of business, quote unquote, is actually operating on a human level. And that's a place that technology can't go. It's a place that technology is not going to go for a very long time. I think that's a very important point. No one's working on trying to make computing have some of the biological and neurological features that we have. And we can debate what is a human. There's all sorts of metaphysical questions about that. But AI is not even trying to be like us anytime soon. And therefore, we've got the opportunity of designing around difference as opposed to designing around similarity, which seems to be our pathological obsession at the moment.
Yeah. There's one thing I wanted to ask, Rob, because Rita mentioned Aristotle there, and it reminded me of something that you said at one of our events about us needing to, when we're thinking about AI of the future, sort of training it with these kind of classic moral quandaries that you got from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Yeah, and I know that's the area of passion of yours. I'd like to get you to explore your thoughts on this, because it seems to me even as humans we don't really have like answers to these things. Even like a classic trolley problem, what it's fundamentally very difficult. And then yeah, separately, how we use AI ethically, I think, is kind of a different question to having an ethical AI.
There's something called alignment faking, where AI pretends it's doing something that it isn't doing. And of course, all the talk is it's lying and all these sorts of things. What it's actually trying to do is trade off conflicting goals, just like we do. And it's trying to do the least worst thing. And the least worst thing it thinks it can do is lie to one person as opposed to undo its values for everyone. That's what it's essentially trying to do. It's doing things that are very similar to humans. And so we set these standards of perfection for technology for some reason, and yet there's no reason why we should have that expectation, because it faces all the same problems that we do. And therefore, some kind of multi-pronged approach is needed. There's lots of ethics codes, hundreds of them actually, and they take us so far, but they're actually quite brittle. And the idea that you were referring to, my question is, can you train a model so that it has some kind of sophisticated recognition of morality because it's been trained on the world's encoded ethical knowledge? In the end, we're going to have to put some ethical decision-making into AI that's not just us coding rules, because that's too brittle.
And also, I'm just thinking about, combining the mention of, philosophy, Aristotle, and everything else. I'm thinking also about democracy, and some of these decisions. I think we will have to get more public engagement in them. I mean, I'm a big fan, for example, of deliberative democracy, citizens, juries, etc., when you have very tough ethical dilemmas, or you have lots of trade-offs to be had, with the National Health Service, for example, or policy on certain ethical issues. And I think that this would really help engage organizations and companies with both their customer base and also broader society if they got them involved in these sort of decisions. Because otherwise, we'll fall more and more into that trap of, the elite making decisions on behalf of everyone else. And again, if we want to engage with our people, with customers, and the world at large, I think we do need to have that sort of involvement. So I think that one thing we are seeing more of is co-creation of solutions, co-creation of some of these new models of thinking, which again, I think are really very healthy to have. And I think just the other thing I'd say, and just coming back to one of the original questions about what implications for organizations is AI having? I think it is making sure that all of us stay open-minded. I mean, people who are closed-minded, they probably ought to either leave the workplace or, I don't know, go and do some of the jobs that that are well publicized, will be impervious to AI, like driveway cleaning and some of those things. But I do think that you've got to stay curious and open-minded, and recruiting people who are like that, who can connect with other human beings, who can think in the ways of both ethics and creativity that we're thinking about that can't be replicated. You've got to have the original sin or the original idea before you can then apply it more broadly. So I think that there are a lot of implications for us, philosophical, operational, obviously financial, because I'm sure you'll come on to what boards might be thinking about doing or need to be thinking about doing, because obviously boards are boards got a big responsibility for priorities, resource allocation, what sort of CEO they're recruiting, who is going to get this sort of stuff, and also be able to lead people, give people confidence about walking into a future that might look physically quite different, but fundamentally, I think will be even closer to why we're here as humanity in some very, very fundamental questions. It was fascinating listening to Elon Musk last year about some of these fundamental questions, or whatever one might think about the man, but he certainly does pose some extremely fundamental questions about why we're here and, frankly, why we ought to maybe be in some other places around the universe. But he's very clear that there's a strong possibility that AI, and applying AI to robotics, these are things that can make us happier because they'll take away some of the tasks. They will, they can be trained to help people. These are things, these are enormous, fascinating things. And obviously, we're all still, though, trying to deal with what does it mean next week, 6 months' time, 3 years' time? How should we be planning? And I think all I'd say to that is you've got to stay focused around your customers, who you are, and how you can help them better. And your customers are human beings. You have people in the company who are human beings. You are human. And this is a very helpful thing to focus on.
Just to add to that, and by the way, if you were looking for people to have a profound disagreement, you picked the wrong two people. But this idea of staying open-minded is so important, because if we look at previous technology-driven transitions, or perhaps revolutions even, in the Industrial Revolution, jobs disappeared before new categories of job emerged. There was a lag. And it was very disruptive and very painful for parts of society. But ultimately, more jobs were created than destroyed. And it was impossible to envisage what those new jobs were at the time that we could really see very clearly which jobs might go. That happened again in the internet revolution. Physical travel agencies virtually disappeared. There's some niche ones left, but that whole industry was decimated very, very quickly. But there were 30 million web developer jobs created off the back of that, which by definition had not existed prior to the internet. Now, one thing that generative AI is really good at is web development. So those jobs are going to be largely automated. But now we have prompt engineering. Who knew? It's not trivial to get outputs from AI. It actually takes a lot of knowledge to do that in a sophisticated way. And that's a whole new discipline that's emerging. And so history tells us that at the equivalent place that we are today on AI, we can't see over the horizon to many things that will emerge as opportunities. It's much easier to see what we might lose. And therefore, we have to continue to have an open mind and to evolve and to be creative, because the vast majority of what's going to happen, we can't see from here.
Yeah, I guess it's that balancing the risks and innovation. I think you're quite right. My partner always uses the analogy of when we used to have horse-drawn carts, and we don't think about ever going back. We're only ever going forward. I wonder if either of you have any like stories or examples where you've really seen it go wrong in organizations trying, maybe moving too fast, or what lessons can we learn going forward?
The only thing I'd say there is, in terms of mistakes, I mean, we all make mistakes all the time. And just back to the staying open-minded and curious, I think one thing that, of course, we are all seeing in all of our businesses is, you could experiment and need to experiment constantly. And, the whole thing about develop fast, fail fast, learn fast. I mean, I think that's just an ever accelerating cycle. So trying a lot of stuff and seeing what works. I mean, that's always been, in my view, the best approach to business, not punishing failure, learning from it. I mean, all of those things that are fundamental, in my view, to good leadership, not creating a sense of fear, not creating a sense of constant defensiveness, encouraging collaboration, because everybody can benefit from collaboration. I think we will see silos coming down, as Rob was saying. I mean, whole job roles, job families may well disappear or then morph into something else, and the importance of actually having people working in collaboration. And by the way, I think sectors can and will need to work in collaboration with some of these changes. Well, we will need to see some system shifts within sectors. I mean, if you look at agriculture, for example, that's demanded much more collaboration and cooperation, pre-competitive collaboration, because you need to get a system change. You've got farmers and you've got retailers and you've got customers and you've got regulators. I mean, you needed a whole system change behind that. And a lot of the learning and the data and the application, of course, can be supported by changing technology, but you needed to get a group of human beings together to do that. But you do need to be prepared to experiment, even in a small way, and do a lot of things. And that's back to fundamental, leadership principles and good practice, in my view. And this is even going back to Good to Great and some of those extraordinary business books with fundamental principles. We're just accelerating our ability to do that, and obviously are able to do it via digital twins. I mean, you can do all sorts of interesting stuff now. And again, that's why I think it makes being in business now is just an extraordinary thing to be. So I think, not sure about retiring. I think, on the contrary, there was a wonderful woman on social media the other day, and she was, I think, in her 70s, still incredibly active and energetic. I don't know, I'm mentioning this, maybe I'm feeling particularly, sensitive about this myself, but the person who was interviewing her was saying, how do you still look vibrant, and what makes you confident? And she was saying, I took a piece of advice from a cardiologist some years ago, and he said, when you get to a certain age, people are going to tell you, just take it easy. And she said that was terrible advice. He agreed that was terrible advice. In fact, as you get older, you shouldn't take it easy. You should take it hard. Go up 2 steps at a time, stay alive. And I guess all of this just feeds into the idea of staying alive, staying engaged, staying open-minded, experimenting. Obviously, as a grown-up, sensible board, you need to get a proportion on this, a proportion of resource allocation, priorities, etc., to make sure you don't do mad things, and you certainly live within your ethos with some of your regulatory pressures. But you've got to really try stuff. And I think that's exciting.
Just to answer your question about mistakes, and just connecting to what Rita said, I read a book in the 1980s that I've still got a copy. It had some great little pithy pieces of advice in bold type in various places in the book. And one was, if you don't know what you're doing, don't do it on a large scale. And I think it is a profoundly applicable piece of advice for AI. It is great to experiment and fail and learn, but do it on a small scale. Do it on something important and relevant, but don't try and scale. That's the biggest mistake I've seen in technology in a career spanning now 3 decades. People sometimes inaugurate these huge programs. They're not entirely sure where they're going. They spend a lot of money. It turns out that a lot of it was not beneficial. Very high levels of complexity, huge overruns. and so on. It's better to start somewhere, learn, and then scale. And that's a mistake that's still being made. And it's still being made partly because the ecosystem around the technology industry benefits from large things, large license sales, large integration projects. They benefit everyone except the end client. And we need to do more small scale experimenting and less monolithic, ideological program, because very few of those work. I would also say this: the vast majority of businesses can afford to be a second mover. They can slowly build capability in something new at small scale, and they can wait for someone else in the industry somewhere to crack the code, and then they can follow fast. The people who crack the code will typically have spent 10 times more money doing it. And yet there's this whole FOMO pressure, there's investor pressure, there's a sort of existential threat narrative, which could easily encourage people into doing the wrong thing too quickly. We do have time. The digital transition started in the mid-90s and is still continuing, actually. Things like digital twins. This has really helped us in the pandemic and with tariffs to change supply chains. It matured, that whole development has matured over 20 years, and AI is going to do the same. We're in the really early phase, and we shouldn't be pressured into doing things that we're not clear about. Occasionally, when I get a CEO on their own, they might say to me, "We don't know what to do." They can never say that, though, in public, because it's share price sensitive and so on. But I think there are many people, leaders in business, who aren't sure what to do. And in most cases, they can probably afford to wait a little bit for it to become clearer.
Thank you, Rob, Rita, for sharing such thoughtful insights today. I guess a key few themes that stood out for me is leaders need to balance technology adoption, both empathy and value, the real things that make us human. And boards and executives are going to have to manage a lot of risks while preparing for this uncharted tomorrow. That's all for this episode of Inspiring Leaders. If you enjoyed this discussion, please share it with your colleagues and subscribe for more conversations with leaders shaping the future of business. I'm Bridgette Hall. Thanks for listening.